The worst jobs in ancient history. Welcome to hell on earth. You wake up. The sun hasn't risen yet, but you're already drenched in sweat that isn't entirely your own. Your nostrils burn with a stench so thick you can taste it, a cocktail of rotting flesh, fermented urine, and something far, far worse. Your hands are stained brown up to the elbows, and there's something squishy between your toes that you pray is just mud. But deep down, you know better. Congratulations. You've just discovered you're working one of the worst jobs in ancient history. No warning, no benefits, no deodorant. Just you, a primitive tool, and a lifetime of unspeakable filth ahead of you. Before we dive any deeper into this cesspit of human misery, and I mean that literally, drop a comment below telling me what country you're watching from and what time it is there, because misery loves company, and I want to know if you're suffering through this at 3 a.m. or trying to eat lunch while I describe the finer points of medieval sewage diving. Trust me, knowing that someone in Tokyo is dry heaving at their desk, while someone in London is questioning their life choices over morning coffee, makes this whole experience so much more delightfully horrifying. Now, let's talk about just how spectacularly awful life could be if you drew the short straw in the ancient employment lottery. You think your boss is bad. At least they don't require you to dive into pits of rotting human waste for a living. At least your worst day at the office doesn't involve scraping centuries-old excrement with your bare hands while praying you don't drown in someone else's digestive failures. Welcome to the world where workplace safety meant try not to die. Today, where benefits meant you might survive long enough to have children who can also suffer, and where the worst job description you can imagine was just Tuesday for thousands of poor souls throughout history. Chapter 1. The corpse burners of ancient India, when death becomes your day job. Picture this, it's ancient India, around 500 BCE. The sun has set, and while normal people are settling down for the evening, you're just starting your shift. You're a dom, a member of the lowest caste whose hereditary job is handling the dead. Not just handling them, burning them, day after day, night after night, until the smell of charred human flesh becomes as familiar as your own breath. You arrive at the Ghat, the burning ground by the river, and the smell hits you like a physical wall. It's not just smoke. It's the sweet, cloying stench of human fat rendering, mixed with the acrid burn of hair and the metallic temps of blood that hasn't quite dried. The pyres are already stacked high with corpses in various states of decomposition. Some fresh from death, others bloated and green, having waited days for their turn in the flames. Your job isn't just to light the fires and walk away. Oh no, that would be too easy. You have to tend these pyres for hours, sometimes days, turning the bodies with long iron rods to ensure complete cremation. The fat drips and splatters, sending up clouds of greasy smoke that burns your eyes and coats your lungs. In the monsoon season, the wood is damp and the fires burn low and slow, meaning bodies can take up to 8 hours to fully burn, and you're standing there the entire time, breathing in what used to be someone's grandmother. But here's where it gets really special. Not all bodies burn the same way. Children and infants don't burn completely. Their small bones often survive the flames, and it's your job to collect these charred fragments and throw them into the river. Pregnant women are even worse. Sometimes the heat causes the corpse to give birth to a partially cremated fetus, which then has to be dealt with separately. And don't even get me started on the bodies that arrive already decomposing. The maggots don't just disappear in the fire, they cook and pop like rice, filling the air with the sound of tiny explosions and the smell of burnt protein. The social isolation is almost as brutal as the physical demands. As a corpse burner, you're considered so polluted by death that you can't enter temples, can't eat with others, can't even draw water from the same wells as the upper castes. You live in a separate part of town, downwind from everyone else, because even when you're not working, the smell of death clings to you like a second skin. Your children will be corpse burners too, because this isn't just a job. It's a hereditary curse passed down through generations, according to the ancient texts, including references in the Manusmriti, the law book of ancient India. Corpse burners were considered so impure that even their shadow could pollute food. They were paid in rice and leftover scraps, never money, because handling currency would contaminate it. They were required to ring bells when walking through towns to warn people of their approach, like medieval lepers, ensuring they could maintain the appropriate distance from anyone who still had hope of spiritual purity. The tools of the trade were horrifically simple: long iron rods for turning bodies, wooden paddles for stoking fires, and bare hands for everything else. No gloves, no masks, no protection whatsoever from the constant exposure to smoke, ash, and bodily fluids. Most corpse burners developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing smoke and ash for decades. Their life expectancy was roughly 40 years, assuming they didn't die from the various diseases that came with constant exposure to decomposing flesh. During plague years, which happened frequently in ancient India, the job became exponentially worse. Bodies would arrive faster than they could be burned, creating massive piles of rotting corpses that festered in the heat. The corpse burners worked around the clock, often collapsing from exhaustion and heat stroke while surrounded by the dead. Some would hallucinate from the constant exposure to smoke and the psychological trauma of handling so much death. Others simply walked into the fires themselves, choosing burning alive over another day of their living hell. But wait, there's more. The job wasn't just burning complete bodies. Accident victims, people mauled by animals, bodies that had been in the river for weeks, they all ended up on your pyres. Sometimes you'd get a body that was more liquid than solid, requiring you to soak up the decomposition fluids with rags before attempting cremation. Other times, you'd receive bodies that had been partially eaten by vultures or wild dogs, leaving you to burn whatever remained while trying not to think about what was missing. The worst part: this wasn't considered a horrible job by society. It was considered necessary and sacred. The corpse burners were told they were performing essential spiritual work, ensuring the proper passage of souls to the afterlife. They were simultaneously reviled and needed, despised and dependent upon. It was the ultimate cosmic joke. Society couldn't function without them, but their very existence was seen as proof of spiritual contamination. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, consider this. In many regions, corpse burners were also responsible for handling Ganga, the ritual disposal of bodies in the sacred river. But rivers don't always cooperate. Bodies would wash back to shore, waterlogged and even more decomposed than when they went in. Guess who had to wade into the water, sometimes chest deep in the sacred Ganges, to retrieve these bloated, rotting corpses and try burning them again? The seasonal aspects made everything worse. During the hot season, bodies decomposed so quickly that they'd often burst from internal gas pressure before reaching the burning ground, covering the transport carts and anyone nearby in putrid fluids. During the monsoon, everything stayed damp: the wood, the bodies, your clothes, your skin, creating the perfect environment for fungal infections and tropical diseases that could turn a simple cut into a death sentence. Still think your Monday morning meetings are rough. Chapter 2. Roman Arena, Blood Gutters, Cleaning Up After Glory. Now, let's travel to Rome. Around 100 CE, where the Colosseum is in full swing and you've just discovered your calling as a bestiarius, but not the kind that fights wild beasts. No, you're the other kind. The kind that comes in after the entertainment to clean up what's left of both man and beast. The glory ends, the crowds go home, and you get to work in what can only be described as the world's largest, most sophisticated slaughterhouse. The arena floor is covered in sand. But that sand isn't decorative. It's there to soak up the blood. By the end of a typical day of games, this sand has absorbed enough human and animal blood to create a crimson mud that squelches under your feet with every step. Your job is to rake through this bloody sand, removing the larger chunks of flesh, scattered teeth, severed fingers, and the occasional eyeball that rolled too far from its owner. But the gore on the surface is just the beginning. The arena had an elaborate underground system called the Hypogeum, a network of tunnels, chambers, and elevators that delivered animals and condemned criminals to their deaths above. And guess what accumulates in underground chambers filled with caged, terrified animals and sweating, bleeding humans? If you guessed a cocktail of every bodily fluid imaginable, congratulations, you're getting the hang of ancient job hunting. The Hypogeum was your real workplace. Down there, in the dim light of oil lamps, you'd wade through ankle-deep mixtures of blood, urine, vomit, and feces while clearing out the remains of whatever had been hauled up to die for public entertainment. The stone floors were slick with bodily fluids that had accumulated over days, sometimes weeks. The smell was indescribable. Imagine a medical waste facility crossed with a public toilet that hasn't been cleaned since the fall of the Republic. The variety of carnage you had to clean up was truly impressive. On normal days, you'd have your standard gladiator fights, relatively clean deaths, just some blood and the occasional severed limb to collect. But then there were the specialty events. Damnatio ad bestias, execution by wild beasts, where condemned criminals were literally torn apart by lions, bears, and specially trained leopards. Your job was to gather up whatever pieces the animals didn't eat and hose down the arena. For the next round, wild beast hunts, or venations, were even messier. These weren't fair fights, they were elaborate slaughters, where hundreds of exotic animals were killed for sport. Elephants, rhinos, hippos, lions, bears, and ostriches were all massacred in choreographed displays of Roman power over nature. By the end of these events, the arena looked like a war zone, and you were the cleanup crew armed with buckets, rakes, and a strong stomach. The tools of your trade were depressingly simple: wooden rakes for gathering chunks of flesh, metal hooks for dragging larger body parts, buckets for collecting fluids, and lime for trying to mask the smell. You worked in teams, because no one person could handle the psychological and physical demands of cleaning up after a full day of systematic killing. Many workers developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, becoming alcoholics or simply walking away from the job, leaving Rome to find new workers among the desperate and the condemned. According to records from historians like Pliny and Suetonius, arena workers were recruited from the absolute bottom of Roman society: slaves, criminals, and foreigners who had no other options. They were housed near the arena in conditions that were described as worse than the animals. Many died from infections caused by constantly handling decomposing flesh and working in unsanitary conditions. Others were accidentally killed when animals escaped during transport or when the complex elevator systems malfunctioned, crushing workers in the underground chambers. The seasonal schedule made everything worse. During summer festivals, games could run for weeks at a time. The arena was used almost daily, meaning there was never time for proper cleaning. Layers of blood and decomposing organic matter built up on the sand and in the underground chambers. The smell became so intense that even spectators in the upper tiers of the Colosseum complained about the stench wafting upward. But here's the really special part. You weren't just cleaning up after the deaths. You were also responsible for maintaining the animals before they were killed. The hypogeum housed hundreds of wild animals in cramped, filthy conditions. These beasts were often starved to make them more aggressive during the games, which meant they spent their final days in a state of constant hunger and fear, defecating and urinating in their cages while you cleaned around them. Injured animals that didn't die quickly enough in the arena were your responsibility to lions with spear wounds, bears missing limbs, elephants with infected cuts. All had to be either finished off or nursed back to health for future games. This meant getting within striking distance of wounded, terrified predators while trying to provide medical care with primitive tools and no anesthetic. The psychological toll was immense. Workers frequently reported nightmares, panic attacks, and what ancient sources described as madness brought on by too much death. Some developed an obsession with cleaning themselves, scrubbing their skin raw in futile attempts to remove the smell and feel of death. Others went the opposite direction, becoming so desensitized to gore that they lost their ability to function in normal society. During Emperor Trajan's Dacian Games in 106 CE, the festivities lasted 123 days and involved the deaths of over 11,000 animals and thousands of gladiators and criminals. For arena workers, this meant for months of non-stop carnage cleanup. Many didn't survive the ordeal. Some died from exhaustion, others from disease, and a few simply disappeared, presumably having walked into the arena themselves, rather than clean up one more day of systematic slaughter. The pay was minimal, just enough food to survive and a place to sleep, usually in dormitories that stank of blood and death because workers could never fully clean themselves. There were no days off, no retirement plan, and no hope of advancement. You did this job until you died, and then someone else equally desperate took your place. And just to add insult to injury, arena workers were required to maintain a cheerful demeanor when the public was present. You couldn't show disgust, fear, or revulsion while cleaning up human remains in front of paying customers. You had to act like scooping up someone's intestines was just another day at the office, because the illusion of Roman civilization and superiority had to be maintained at all times. Still think dealing with difficult customers is the worst part of your job. Chapter 3: Mesopotamian Sewer Divers, the Original Tunnel Rats. Welcome to ancient Babylon. Around 2000 BCE, where humanity has just invented one of its greatest innovations, the sewer system. Mesopotamians were the first civilization to formally address sanitation problems, creating elaborate networks of clay pipes and underground channels to carry waste away from populated areas. Which brings us to you, standing waist-deep in a narrow tunnel filled with several centuries' worth of human excrement, armed with nothing but a bronze scraper and the kind of desperation that only comes from having no other options in life. You are a Mushinu, a sewer diver, tunnel crawler, and all-around subterranean waste management specialist. Your job is to maintain the underground network of sewage channels that keeps Babylonian civilization from drowning in its own filth. And let me tell you, after 4,000 years of technological progress, modern sewer workers still consider this one of the worst jobs on Earth. Now imagine doing it with Bronze Age technology and no understanding of germs. The Mesopotamian sewer system was actually quite sophisticated for its time. Vertical shafts connected to horizontal tunnels that carried waste to large cesspits outside the city walls. The problem was that these systems constantly clogged, overflowed, and filled with debris. Clay pipes cracked, releasing sewage into the surrounding soil. Tree roots broke through tunnel walls. Dead animals fell into vertical shafts and created dams of rotting flesh. And when the spring floods came, the entire system would back up, creating underground lakes of fermented human waste. That's where you came in. Armed with bronze tools, clay oil lamps, and an apparently defective sense of smell, you would descend into these flooded tunnels to clear blockages, repair damaged pipes, and remove whatever horrific combinations of organic matter had accumulated. Since your last visit, the tunnels were barely wide enough for a human body, so you'd crawl through the darkness, feeling your way through ankle-deep sludge that contained everything that had ever gone down. A Mesopotamian toilet. The composition of ancient sewage was uniquely horrifying. This wasn't just human waste, it was human waste mixed with food scraps, dead animals, broken pottery, textile fibers, and whatever else people threw down their primitive drains. The lack of toilet paper meant that people used broken pottery, shards, stones, or their hands for cleaning, all of which ended up in the sewer system. Decomposing organic matter created methane gas that could kill you if you weren't careful about ventilation. According to cuneiform records from the period, sewer divers had one of the highest death rates of any profession in Mesopotamia. They died from drowning in sewage, from toxic gas poisoning, from infections caused by constant exposure to human waste, and from tunnel collapses that left them buried alive under tons of clay and excrement. The average career lasted about 5 years, assuming you survived the initial training period. The work was seasonal, which somehow made it worse. During the dry season, the sewage would concentrate and harden, creating blockages that required chipping away with bronze tools. The smell intensified as water levels dropped, creating a thick paste of fermented waste that clung to everything it touched. During the rainy season, flash floods would turn the tunnels into underground rapids of sewage that could sweep workers away and drown them in a current of liquid excrement. Your tools were primitively simple: bronze scrapers for breaking up blockages, clay pots for collecting debris, wooden paddles for moving sludge, and oil lamps that frequently went out, leaving you trapped in absolute darkness while standing in sewage. No protective clothing, no breathing apparatus, no safety lines, just you and whatever horrors had accumulated in the darkness below. Babylon, the social status of sewer divers, was about what you'd expect. Ancient Mesopotamian society was strictly hierarchical, and people who spent their days covered in excrement weren't invited to many dinner parties. Sewer divers lived in designated areas downwind from the main population, were banned from certain temples and public spaces, and were required to announce their profession when entering markets so vendors could decide whether to serve them. But here's where it gets really interesting. Mesopotamian sewers weren't just filled with waste. They were also used for disposal of unwanted babies, executed criminals, and plague victims. So your routine maintenance work might involve pulling, decomposing human corpses out of blockages, trying to determine which skeletal remains were recent, and which had been down there for decades. Children's bones were particularly common, as infanticide was practiced throughout the ancient world, and sewers provided a convenient disposal method. The tunnels were also home to various forms of wildlife that had adapted to the underground environment. Rats the size of cats thrived in the sewers, feeding on waste and occasionally on workers who became trapped or unconscious. Venomous snakes often used the tunnels as shelter, creating the constant threat of snake bites while working in cramped, dark conditions. Large insects and spiders were everywhere, and many workers developed severe phobias or mental illness from constant exposure to these creatures in dark, confined spaces. Disease was a constant companion. Dysentery, cholera, and various parasitic infections were occupational hazards. Many sewer divers developed chronic skin conditions from constant contact with sewage. Eye infections were common from working in darkness with inadequate lighting. Respiratory problems developed from breathing sewer gas and methane. Most workers died before age 35, either from disease, accidents, or the cumulative effects of toxic exposure. The payment system was typically grain rations and a place to sleep, usually in communal housing that other workers described as smelling like the sewers. There was no concept of hazard pay or occupational safety. You did this job because you were desperate, because you were a slave, or because you had committed crimes that made this your only alternative to execution. But wait, there's more. During times of war or siege, the sewers became military targets. Enemies would try to poison water supplies by dumping dead animals or human corpses into the sewer system upstream from cities. This meant sewer divers often found themselves dealing with decomposing war casualties in addition to normal waste, and they were frequently suspected of being spies or saboteurs, making them targets for both sides in any conflict. The effects were severe and well documented in ancient sources. Many sewer divers developed what was described as tunnel madness, a condition involving paranoia, hallucinations, and an obsessive need to clean themselves that could never be satisfied. Some became unable to tolerate bright light after spending so much time underground. Others developed a condition where they could no longer distinguish smells, making them unable to detect dangerous gases or spoiled food. Religious ceremonies required ritual purification that sewer divers could never achieve. They were considered permanently polluted and were banned from most religious festivals and ceremonies. When they died, their bodies were often dumped in the same sewers where they had worked, as many burial grounds refused to accept them, and here's the final insult. The job was hereditary. Children of sewer divers became sewer divers, creating dynasties of underground waste management that lasted for generations. There was no social mobility, no career advancement, no hope of escape. You were born into the sewers, you lived in the sewers, and you died in the sewers. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe sewer divers as the people who walk in darkness beneath the light, which sounds poetic until you realize it's literally describing humans who spent their entire lives crawling through tunnels filled with excrement, while the rest of civilization enjoyed the benefits of sanitation above their heads. Still think working from home is isolated. Chapter 4. Egyptian Embalmers, Elbow Deep in Eternity. Ancient Egypt, land of pharaohs, pyramids, and the most sophisticated death industry the world had ever seen. You've just woken up to discover you're a Weti, a junior embalmer. In Memphis, around 1500 BCE, the good news: you're part of a sacred profession that ensures eternal life for the deceased. The bad news. You're about to spend the next several decades with your hands inside more corpses than a serial killer. And that's just a typical Tuesday. The mummification process took 70 days, and every single one of those days involved handling decomposing human flesh in various stages of putrefaction. Your workshop, the Pernefair House of Beauty, was located downwind from the city for obvious reasons. The moment you approach for your morning shift, the smell hits you like a physical wall, a mixture of natron salt, palm wine, frankincense, and the sweet, cloying stench of human flesh slowly drying into leather. Let's start with brain removal, shall we? The Egyptians believed the brain was useless, clearly. They'd never met your modern boss, so your job was to scramble it with a long bronze hook and extract it through the nasal cavity. Picture this: you insert a metal rod the length of a ruler through someone's nostril, push it until you feel it penetrate the skull. Then stir vigorously until the brain becomes liquid. The sound alone, like stirring thick porridge mixed with gravel, was enough to drive new embalmers to madness. But here's the really fun part. Brains don't come out easily. You had to turn the corpse upside down and shake it vigorously to drain out the liquefied brain matter through the nose. Sometimes chunks would get stuck, requiring you to go back in with the hook to fish out stubborn pieces of cerebral cortex. Fresh corpses were easier. Older corpses, especially those that had been sitting in the heat for days before reaching your workshop, had brains that were already partially decomposed and would come out in a chunky, grey-green soup that smelled like rotting fish mixed with vinegar. Then came the abdominal evisceration, and this is where the job really got interesting. Using a bronze knife, you'd make a single incision along the left side of the abdomen and reach inside to remove everything that might decay. And I mean everything. Liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, all had to come out through that one small hole. Have you ever tried to pull 20 feet of intestines through a 4-inch incision? It's like the world's most disgusting magic trick. The intestines were the worst part. They were often full of partially digested food and fecal matter, and they had to be cleaned before being placed in canopic jars. This meant washing them in palm wine while scraping out their contents with your fingers. The smell was indescribable. Imagine a combination of vomit, sewage, and rotting meat, concentrated by the Egyptian heat until it became a visible haze that hung round the workshop like a malevolent spirit. According to the historical accounts from Herodotus and various papyrus texts, embalmers were divided into strict hierarchies. At the top were the master embalmers who performed the religious ceremonies and made the initial cuts. At the bottom were people like you, the organ removers, the washers, the ones who did all the actual touching of decomposing flesh. The master embalmers wore clean linen and ceremonial masks. You got a loincloth and a rag to cover your nose, assuming you were lucky. The natron treatment was particularly brutal. After removing the organs, the body cavity was packed with natron salt and left to dehydrate for 40 days. Your job was to check on these bodies daily, replacing the natron as it became saturated with bodily fluids. The natron would form a kind of bloody brine that had to be carefully drained and disposed of. Bodies didn't dehydrate evenly. Fingers and toes would become hard and brittle, while the torso was still soft and squishy. The workshop conditions were horrific. This was the Egyptian desert, remember, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You were working in stone buildings with minimal ventilation, surrounded by dozens of decomposing bodies in various stages of the mummification process. The heat intensified every smell, every sensation. Flies were constant companions, laying eggs in any exposed flesh and creating maggot infestations that you had to clean out daily. But here's where it gets really special. Not everyone who came to your workshop was recently dead. Sometimes bodies arrived that had been dead for weeks, either because they'd been lost in the desert or because the family couldn't afford immediate mummification. These corpses were already partially decomposed, with skin slipping off in sheets and internal organs liquefied into a putrid soup. You still had to mummify them, which meant working with flesh that came apart in your hands and dealing with the most horrific smells imaginable. The social aspects made everything worse. Embalmers were considered ritually impure by their constant contact with death. You couldn't enter certain temples, couldn't participate in religious festivals, and were required to live in designated areas away from the general population. Even other unclean professions, like tanners and fishermen, considered embalmers beneath them. Your children would likely become embalmers too, because few other professions would accept someone born into a family of corpse handlers. The religious ceremonies added layers of complexity to the already horrific job. Each stage of mummification required specific prayers and rituals that had to be performed while you were working. So while you're elbow deep in someone's abdominal cavity, scraping out their liver, you're also supposed to be chanting sacred texts and maintaining proper religious decorum. Try reciting holy prayers while the person you're working on suddenly releases gas from decomposition, filling the air with the concentrated essence of their last meal. The tools were primitive but effective. Bronze knives for cutting, wooden paddles for stirring natron, clay pots for organs, and linen strips for wrapping. Everything had to be ritually purified between uses, which meant more ceremonies and more time spent handling sacred objects while covered in decomposition fluids. The bronze tools would develop a patina from constant exposure to bodily acids, and the wooden implements would absorb odors so thoroughly that even new tools smelled like death. Different social classes received different levels of mummification, which meant different levels of horror for you. Wealthy pharaohs got the full treatment, every organ carefully removed and preserved, every finger individually wrapped, the finest linens and resins. Poor people got the economy package. You'd inject turpentine into their anus and let it dissolve their internal organs, then drain it out along with everything else. Imagine spending your day with a funnel and a tube, pumping caustic chemicals into corpses and then draining out the resulting slurry. The workshop accidents were legendary and often fatal. Embalmers frequently cut themselves with contaminated tools, leading to infections that were invariably deadly in an age before antibiotics. Others developed respiratory diseases from constantly breathing dust made from dried human remains and natron. The most common cause of death among embalmers was what we'd now recognize as sepsis, blood poisoning from handling infected corpses during plague years. The job became exponentially worse. Bodies would arrive faster than they could be processed, creating warehouses full of decomposing corpses waiting their turn for mummification. The smell would become so intense that it could be detected miles away. Many embalmers simply fled during these periods, preferring unemployment to spending their days in what amounted to a massive open-air morgue. But here's the really horrific part. You weren't just dealing with natural deaths. Ancient Egypt practiced human sacrifice, especially during royal funerals, and executed criminals often ended up in your workshop. Some bodies arrived with obvious signs of violence, severed heads, stab wounds, evidence of torture. You were expected to make these corpses presentable for burial, which meant reconstructing faces, reattaching limbs, and somehow making murder victims look peaceful for eternity. The seasonal aspects made everything worse. During the flooding season, when the Nile rose, the increased humidity made decomposition happen faster. Bodies would arrive already crawling, with maggots, and the heat and moisture created perfect conditions for bacterial growth. During the dry season, corpses would be desiccated like jerky, requiring you to rehydrate tissues before beginning the mummification process. And just to add insult to injury, the families of the deceased would often visit during the mummification process to check on progress. So while you're covered in their loved one's bodily fluids, trying to extract a liver that's turned to liquid, grieving relatives would show up expecting updates and wanting to see how their investment was progressing. Customer service in ancient Egypt apparently included explaining why grandpa's intestines were now soup. Still think dealing with difficult clients is challenging. Chapter 5. Medieval plague bearers, deaths, day shift workers. Fast forward to medieval Europe. Around 1348 CE, and you've just discovered you're Rebecca Morty, a plague bearer in Florence during the Black Death. The good news, you have Job. Security, because people are dying faster than anyone can count. The bad news, your life expectancy is measured in weeks, not years. And every single day brings you face to face with the most horrific disease in human history. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, and somebody had to clean up the mess. That somebody was you. Your job was to collect the dead from houses, streets, and ditches, load them onto carts, and transport them to mass burial sites outside the city walls. Simple, right? Except that bubonic plague doesn't kill people prettily, and by the time you arrive to collect bodies, they've often been dead for days in houses where the rest of the family is either dying or has already fled. Picture your typical workday. You arrive at a house where someone has reported deaths. You kick in the door. Families rarely answer anymore and are immediately hit by the smell. Plague victims die from internal bleeding, often vomiting blood in their final hours. The smell isn't just decomposition, it's the metallic stench of coagulated blood mixed with the sweet corruption of bodies that have been swelling in the heat for days. Inside, you find entire families dead in their beds, on the floor, wherever they collapsed during their final agonies. The bubonic form of plague creates massive swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes. Black, pus-filled lumps the size of oranges that often burst before death, covering the victim and everything around them in infected fluid. The pneumonic form is worse. Victims literally cough their lungs to pieces, leaving blood spattered on walls, bedding, and anything within reach of their death throes. Your tools were pathetically inadequate for the job. Wooden carts, leather, gloves if you were lucky, and long-handled hooks for moving bodies without touching them directly. No understanding of contagion beyond bad air. No protective clothing, no disinfectants beyond vinegar and prayer. You loaded decomposing plague-infected corpses with your bare hands, often working alone because finding people desperate enough to take this job was increasingly difficult as the death toll mounted. The bodies themselves were horrific. Plague kills violently and quickly, often within days of the first symptoms. Victims would die with their eyes open, mouths frozen in screams, fingers clawed into whatever they'd grabbed during their final convulsions. Rigor mortis would set in twisted, unnatural positions that made loading bodies onto carts a gruesome puzzle. Sometimes you'd have to break bones to make corpses fit, creating the sickening crack of snapping ribs and joints that echoed through empty streets. According to contemporary accounts from chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio and various church records, plague bearers had the highest mortality rate of any profession during the pandemic. Most lasted less than a month before succumbing to the disease themselves. The job was filled by criminals offered freedom in exchange for body collection, desperate poor people with no other options, and eventually by pressed gangs who were forced into service at sword point. The mass burial sites were scenes from hell itself. Bodies were dumped into enormous pits, sometimes 30 feet deep, and covered with thin layers of lime and soil. But the death rate was so high that bodies would pile up faster than graves could be dug. During the worst periods, corpses would be stacked like cordwood in open fields, creating mountains of decomposing flesh that could be seen and smelled for miles. The social isolation was complete and immediate. Plague bearers were considered walking death, and anyone who saw you approaching would flee. You couldn't enter taverns, churches, or markets. Food had to be left for you at designated spots, and payment, when there was any, was left in bowls of vinegar that supposedly purified the coins. Many plague bearers lived in the cemeteries and burial grounds where they worked, because no one would house them elsewhere. But here's where the job got really special. Not everyone you collected was actually dead. In the chaos and terror of the pandemic, unconscious or catatonic plague victims were often mistaken for corpses and thrown onto the death carts. Your job included checking for signs of life, but with dozens of bodies to collect each day and the constant fear of infection, these checks were often cursory. Many plague bearers reported the horrific experience of hearing moaning or movement from their cartloads, realizing they were transporting living people to mass graves. The psychological toll was immense and immediate. Plague bearers developed what medieval sources described as death madness, a condition involving hallucinations, paranoia, and an obsessive need to count corpses. Many began talking to the dead bodies they collected, carrying on conversations with decomposing plague victims. Others developed a condition where they could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead, approaching living people with hooks and carts. The work was not just collection, but also house cleaning. After removing the dead, you were often responsible for clearing out infected homes, burning bedding, clothing, and personal possessions. This meant spending hours in enclosed spaces where entire families had died, breathing air thick with disease and surrounded by the personal effects of the recently deceased. Children's toys, unfinished meals, letters that would never be sent, all had to be burned while you tried not to think about the lives that had ended there. During winter months, the job became even more horrific. Bodies would freeze solid, making them impossible to load normally. You'd have to break them free from ice, sometimes using axes and hammers to separate corpses that had frozen together. The cold preserved bodies longer, which meant they'd accumulate in larger numbers before you could collect them, creating massive piles of frozen corpses that had to be thawed. Before burial, the plague carts themselves became sources of infection. The wooden surfaces absorbed bodily fluids and couldn't be properly cleaned. The smell of death soaked into the wood so thoroughly that even empty carts could be detected from hundreds of yards away. Many carts were eventually burned and replaced. But during the height of the pandemic, there wasn't time or resources for such luxuries. Religious ceremonies became impossible. Churches refused to hold funerals for plague victims, and priests wouldn't perform last rites for fear of infection. As a plague bearer, You were considered so contaminated that you couldn't enter consecrated ground even when not working. Your own death, when it inevitably came, would be unmarked and unmourned, just another body for the next plague bearer to collect. The payment system was typically food rations and access to abandoned houses for shelter. Money was often worthless. During the pandemic anyway, as normal economic activity collapsed, some plague bearers survived by looting the homes they cleared, taking whatever valuables they could find from families who no longer needed them. This led to a secondary profession of plague grave robbers, who would return to burial sites to strip bodies of jewelry and dental work. And here's the final horror. The job never ended. Even after the initial wave of plague deaths, you were still needed for the ongoing casualties, the delayed deaths from secondary infections, and the cleanup of areas that had been abandoned during the worst periods. Some cities had neighborhoods that were completely empty except for corpses, requiring months of systematic body collection long after the pandemic had officially ended. Medieval records show that most plague bearers died within a month of starting the job, but their deaths were rarely recorded. They simply disappeared, becoming part of the anonymous masses buried in plague pits. The few who survived often lived only a few more years before succumbing to diseases contracted during their work or to the psychological trauma that made normal life impossible. Still think your job is stressful. Chapter 6. Roman Fullers, piss-soaked and proud. Welcome to ancient Rome, around 50 CE, where you've just discovered you're a fullo, a cloth cleaner working in one of the city's many fulling establishments. The good news: you're part of an essential industry that keeps Roman togas sparkling white. The bad news: you're about to spend your career standing knee-deep in other people's urine while stomping on expensive fabrics. And somehow this was considered a respectable trade. The fulling process was Rome's answer to dry cleaning. Except instead of chemical solvents, Romans used human urine as their primary cleaning agent. Urine contains ammonia, which is excellent for removing grease and stains from wool and linen. Your job was to collect this urine from public urinals around the city, transport it to the fullery, and then literally dance in it while cleaning. Clothes. Picture your morning routine. You arrive at work as the sun rises, and immediately your nostrils are assaulted by the concentrated stench of hundreds of gallons of stale urine that has been fermenting overnight in stone vats. The smell is so intense it burns your eyes and makes breathing difficult. But this is just the beginning. You strip down to a loincloth, step into a vat filled with urine that reaches your knees, and begin the ancient Roman equivalent of the grape-stomping dance. Except, instead of making wine, you're washing someone's party toga in fermented piss. The urine wasn't fresh, mind you. Oh no, that would be too simple. Romans believed that aged urine worked better than fresh urine. So the liquid you were standing in had been sitting in clay pots for days or weeks, developing a concentrated ammonia, content that could strip paint. The fermentation process also produced other delightful compounds that created a bouquet of smells that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem like a flower garden. According to historical accounts from Pliny the Elder and various Roman writers, fullers developed a distinctive walk from spending their days stomping in urine vats. They also developed chronic skin conditions from constant exposure to ammonia, which would burn their legs and feet until the skin became thick and leathery. Many fullers lost their sense of smell entirely within their first year on the job, which was considered a blessing by everyone involved. But the urine was just the beginning of your chemical toolkit. Fullers also used Creta Phallonica, fuller's earth, which was a type of clay that absorbed grease and oils. This clay had to be mixed with the urine to create a paste that was rubbed into stained fabrics. Imagine spending your day covered in a mixture of fermented urine and clay, scrubbing blood and wine stains out of senatorial togas, while trying not to think about where those stains came from. The social aspects of the job were particularly humiliating. Fullers were simultaneously essential and despised. Everyone needed clean clothes, but no one wanted to associate with people who smelled like a public toilet. Fullers were banned from certain public spaces, had to sit in designated areas at public events, and were required to bathe in special facilities downwind from the main population. Even slaves looked down on fullers, because at least slaves didn't choose to spend their days marinating in urine. The collection of urine was a job unto itself. Rome had public urinals on every street corner, and someone had to empty them daily. These weren't the sanitized collection points you might imagine. They were stone troughs, where hundreds of people had urinated, often while drunk, sick, or suffering from various diseases. The urine would be mixed with vomit, blood, and whatever else people had expelled during their night of Roman debauchery. The fullery workshops were located in the poorest sections of Rome, downwind from everything else, because the smell could be detected from miles away. These weren't small operations. Major fulleries employed dozens of workers and processed hundreds of garments daily. The buildings were designed with large open courtyards where urine vats were arranged in rows, creating a grid of human waste that workers navigated like a malodorous maze. Different types of stains required different treatments, which meant different combinations of horror for you. Bloodstains needed to be treated with fresh urine and scrubbed immediately. Grease stains required aged urine mixed with fuller's earth and hours of stomping. Wine stains needed a combination of urine, clay, and sulfur, creating a mixture that produced toxic fumes that would burn your lungs and make your eyes water uncontrollably. The customers made everything worse. Wealthy Romans would send slaves to the fullery with specific instructions about how their expensive garments should be cleaned. These slaves would stand around supervising the process, making sure their master's toga was getting the proper amount of attention while you danced in urine, trying to remove whatever horrific stains had accumulated during the latest orgy or gladiatorial games. The tools of the trade were simple but effective. Wooden paddles for stirring, bronze scrapers for removing stubborn stains, and your own feet. For the primary cleaning action, everything had to be cleaned between uses, which meant more urine and more clay. The wooden tools would absorb odors so thoroughly that even when dry, they smelled like concentrated ammonia mixed with human waste. Seasonal variations made the job even more unbearable. During summer, the heat would concentrate the urine smell, until it became a visible haze hanging over the fullery. Workers would frequently pass out from the fumes, and heat stroke was common among people standing in warm urine for 8 hours a day. During winter, the urine would be ice-cold, causing hypothermia and frostbite on workers' feet and legs. The health effects were immediate and permanent. Fullers developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing ammonia fumes. Their skin would become permanently discolored and scarred from chemical burns. Many developed eye problems from constant exposure to caustic vapors. The average career lasted about 10 years, assuming you survived the initial adaptation period, when many new workers simply died from toxic exposure. And here's the really special part. Fullers were proud of their work. They had their own guild, their own festivals, and their own patron deity, Minerva, goddess of crafts. who presumably held her nose during their religious ceremonies. Fulleries would advertise their services with painted signs showing workers dancing in vats, as if standing knee-deep in fermented urine was something to celebrate. The disposal of used cleaning fluids was another nightmare entirely. After clothes were cleaned, the urine clay mixture had to be dumped somewhere. This was usually done in designated areas outside the city walls, creating vast pools of concentrated waste that would ferment in the sun until they became visible from space. These dump sites were so toxic that nothing would grow there for years, creating permanent dead zones in the Roman countryside. Still think your job stinks. Chapter 7. Ancient miners, digging your own grave now. Let's descend into the literal underworld of ancient employment, the mines. Whether you're extracting silver from the mountains of Greece, digging for gold in Roman-controlled Spain, or hauling copper or in ancient Egypt, you've just discovered that working underground in the ancient world was essentially a delayed death sentence with extra steps. Ancient mining was not the industrial operation you might imagine. This was brutal hand labor performed by slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals who had been condemned to what Romans cheerfully called damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines. It was considered a fate worse than death, and for good reason. Most miners died within 2 years of starting work, and the lucky ones died quickly. Let's start with the working conditions, shall we? Ancient mines were essentially narrow holes dug into mountainsides with bronze and iron tools. No mechanical ventilation, no electric lighting, no safety equipment whatsoever. You worked by the light of oil lamps that frequently went out, leaving you in absolute darkness hundreds of feet underground. The air was thick with dust that would slowly destroy your lungs, assuming you lived long enough for that to matter. The Athenian silver mines at Laurium were particularly horrific. These mines supplied the silver that made Athens wealthy, but they were worked by thousands of slaves who lived and died in underground tunnels. The mine shafts were barely wide enough for a human body, forcing workers to crawl through passages on their hands and knees, while dragging heavy baskets of ore behind them. Many slaves spent their entire short careers underground, never seeing sunlight again after their first descent. Your tools were primitively simple: bronze or iron picks for breaking rock, wooden hammers for driving wedges, leather bags for carrying, or an oil lamps that provided the only light in your underground hell. No protective clothing, no breathing apparatus, no safety lines. Just you, your tools, and the constant threat of cave-ins, gas poisoning, or simply getting lost in the dark and dying alone in a tunnel no one would ever find. The Spanish gold mines, controlled by Rome, were death traps on an industrial scale. Pliny the Elder described these operations as employing thousands of workers, who were literally worked to death extracting precious metals for the empire. The miners worked in shifts around the clock, with dead workers simply dragged out of the tunnels and replaced by fresh slaves from the latest military campaigns. Water was a constant problem in ancient mines. Underground springs would flood tunnels without warning, drowning workers who couldn't escape quickly enough through narrow passages. When mines weren't flooding, they were often filled with toxic gases that would kill miners instantly or slowly poison them over months. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and methane were common mine gases that ancient workers had no way to detect until it was too late. According to historical sources, including accounts from Diodorus Siculus and various Roman administrative records, mine workers were considered expendable resources. They were fed just enough to keep working and were literally worked until they dropped dead. The average lifespan of a mine slave was measured in months, not years. Some mines had mortality rates so high that they required constant streams of new workers, just to maintain production. The Egyptian copper mines in the Sinai Peninsula were particularly brutal. Workers were sent into these mines as punishment, and the conditions were so harsh that assignment to the copper mines was essentially a creative form of execution. The desert heat, combined with underground labor, created an environment where workers would literally cook to death while mining, or for Egyptian bronze workers. But here's where it gets really interesting. Ancient miners weren't just extracting precious metals. They were also mining materials like sulfur, which required working in tunnels filled with toxic gases that would burn your lungs and skin. Sulfur miners rarely lived more than a few months, dying from respiratory failure or chemical burns that would slowly eat away at their bodies. The social hierarchy in mines was particularly cruel. At the bottom were the expendable workers, slaves and criminals, who did the actual digging and died in large numbers. Above them were slightly more valuable slaves, who supervised work gangs and had marginally better chances of survival. At the top were free overseers, who never went underground and viewed workers as replaceable tools rather than human beings. Cave-ins were constant and usually fatal. Ancient mining techniques involved following ore veins wherever they led, often creating unstable tunnel networks that would collapse without warning. Workers trapped in cave-ins would either be crushed instantly or die slowly from suffocation and dehydration while listening to rescue efforts that usually never came. Many mines were simply abandoned after major collapses, leaving dead workers buried forever in their underground tombs. The extraction methods were as dangerous as the working conditions. Roman miners used fire setting, heating rock faces with fires, and then throwing cold water on them to create cracks. This technique filled tunnels with smoke and steam, created unstable rock formations, and often led to underground fires that could burn for years. Workers caught in fire-setting operations often died from smoke inhalation or steam burns. Disease was rampant in mining operations. The combination of poor nutrition, constant exposure to dust and toxins, overcrowded living conditions, and physical exhaustion created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various parasitic infections spread rapidly through mining communities. Workers who became too sick to work were often simply abandoned in the tunnels to die. And here's the final insult. Successful mining operations were considered great achievements of ancient civilization. The silver that funded Athenian democracy, the gold that paid Roman legions, the copper that created the Bronze Age, all of it was extracted by workers who died in agony, so that civilizations could flourish above ground. The same metals that created beautiful art and advanced technology were mined by people whose suffering was considered an acceptable cost of progress. Chapter 8. Rat Catchers and Leech Collectors. The pest management from hell. Finally, let's explore the wonderful world of ancient pest control, where you've just discovered you're either a Rhetorius rat catcher or a Hirudinator leech collector. Both jobs involved dealing with creatures that most people found disgusting, but at least rats and leeches don't judge you for your life choices. They're too busy trying to bite you or drink your blood. Medieval rat catchers were essential. Workers in cities where rats outnumbered humans and carried diseases that could wipe out entire populations. Your job was to crawl into sewers, basements, and abandoned buildings to hunt creatures that were often larger than house cats and had developed a healthy fear of humans through generations of survival experience. Rat catching required specialized skills and equipment. You needed traps, but not the simple snap traps of modern times. Medieval rat traps were elaborate contraptions made of wood and wire that required careful placement and constant maintenance. You also needed bait, which meant carrying around pieces of rotting meat or cheese that would attract rats, while simultaneously attracting flies and creating a portable stench that announced your presence to everyone within a mile radius. The rats themselves were formidable opponents. Medieval European rats were larger and more aggressive than modern varieties. Having been bred by centuries of urban warfare with human rat catchers, they lived in organized colonies, posted sentinels, and would attack in groups when cornered. Many rat catchers bore permanent scars from rat bites, and some died from infections caused by bites that became septic in an age before antibiotics. Leech collection was somehow even worse. Medicinal leeches were essential for medieval medicine, where bloodletting was considered a cure for everything from headaches to demonic possession. Your job was to wade into swamps and stagnant ponds where leeches lived, let them attach to your body, and then carefully remove them for sale to physicians and barbers. The collection process was straightforward but horrifying. You'd wade into leech-infested water wearing minimal clothing, allowing dozens of leeches to attach to your legs and arms. Once they were feeding, you'd carefully remove them and place them in containers filled with pond water. The leeches had to be alive and healthy when delivered, which meant you couldn't just grab them randomly. You had to let them feed on your blood until they were plump and satisfied. According to medieval sources, including various guild records and medical treatises, leech collectors developed a tolerance for blood loss that bordered on the supernatural. They could lose up to a pint of blood during a single collection session and still function normally. Many collectors became anemic and weak, but they were paid well enough to make the health risks worthwhile. The seasonal aspects made both jobs worse. Rats were most active during winter when food was scarce, forcing rat catchers to work in freezing conditions while crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body. Leeches were most active during warm weather, which meant spending summer days standing in stagnant water that bred mosquitoes, flies, and waterborne diseases. Both professions required working alone in dangerous conditions. Rat catchers often worked in abandoned buildings that could collapse, while leech collectors worked in remote swamps where they could disappear without anyone knowing what happened to them. Many practitioners of both trades simply vanished, presumably victims of accidents, violence, or the cumulative effects of their occupational hazards. The social status was about what you'd expect. Both rat catchers and leech collectors were considered necessary but unpleasant, like medieval garbage collectors or executioners. They were tolerated rather than welcomed, paid promptly to encourage them to leave quickly, and generally avoided by anyone with other options. And just to add insult to injury, both jobs required customer service skills. Rat catchers had to explain to clients why their rat problem wasn't immediately solved, while leech collectors had to maintain live inventory that might die if not properly cared for. Nothing quite like trying to convince someone that the rats will eventually be gone while standing in their parlor, covered in bites and smelling like sewer water. So, there you have it, a gentle bedtime tour through some of humanity's most spectacularly awful employment opportunities. From dancing in Roman urine to diving into Mesopotamian sewers, from breathing the smoke of burning corpses to collecting plague victims by the cartload. Our ancestors found truly creative ways to make survival an absolutely miserable experience. Next time you're complaining about your commute, your boss, or your workplace coffee. Take a moment to remember the ancient Egyptian embalmer who spent his day elbow-deep in decomposing pharaohs, or the medieval gong farmer who made his living scraping centuries of excrement out of castle latrines. Your worst Monday morning meeting has nothing on trying to extract someone's liquefied brain through their nostril while maintaining proper religious decorum. These jobs weren't just unpleasant, they were systematic torture disguised as necessary labor. The people who performed them didn't have the luxury of quitting, finding new careers, or filing complaints with human resources. They did these jobs because the alternative was starvation, slavery, or death, and they did them until their bodies gave out or their minds snapped from the accumulated horror. But here's the really remarkable thing. Civilization depended on these jobs. The beautiful art, the magnificent architecture, the philosophical achievements, the military conquests that we associate with ancient civilizations. All of it was built on a foundation of people doing work so horrific that we can barely imagine it today. Someone had to clean up the blood in the Colosseum so the next day's entertainment could proceed. Someone had to maintain the sewers so cities could function. Someone had to handle the dead so the living could pretend death wasn't lurking around. Every corner, these weren't just jobs. They were sacrificial roles in societies that had no concept of worker safety, employee rights, or the basic dignity of labor. The people who performed them were simultaneously essential and disposable, needed and despised, indispensable and utterly replaceable. They lived in the literal shadows of civilization, making it possible for everyone else to enjoy the light. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled bedroom with running water, electricity, modern medicine, and employment, laws protecting you from the worst excesses of capitalist exploitation, spare a thought for the ancient corpse burners still tending their pyres, the Roman fullers still dancing in vats of fermented urine, and the medieval plague-bearers still loading their carts with the victims of humanity's most persistent enemy. Sweet dreams. And remember, no matter how bad your job gets, at least you don't have to fish decomposing bodies out of ancient sewers with a bronze hook, while trying not to drown in 4,000 years of accumulated human waste. Although if you do, there's probably a really interesting story behind how you got there, and I'd love to hear it in the comments.